Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this autism webinar. It's really exciting to see so many of you logged in. Now, I think it's fair to say that autism is probably one of the most misunderstood human conditions. Affects an estimated 700,000 people in the UK alone. We're talking 1 in every 270 people being affected by this condition. If you ask people to explain it, they would probably struggle to come up with a consistent answer. Joining us today to shed some light on the matter and to broaden our understanding is our guest speaker, Pete Warmby. Hi, Pete.
Hi.
Pete is a Lego and video game obsessed parent and a full-time English teacher who just happens to be both very tall and autistic. He writes on key topics such as autism acceptance, education, politics, and gaming. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much for joining us.
We're going to jump into this. The first question, for those that don't understand, what is ASC, ASD, and autism spectrum disorder or autism spectrum condition? I understand there's no right answer here, and you're not talking for everyone when you speak, but like philosophically and stigmatically, there's a distinction between the two, and there's a big focus on correct terminology these days.
There is, yeah. I think as the as the autistic sort of community gets more and more sort of solidified and working together more and communicating together more, there has been a greater sense of we've got to get the language of this right. So we in the community spend a lot of time on this topic, about how to describe ourselves and how to get other people to describe us. The thing with ASD, disorder and condition, I mean, obviously they're two very different words in terms of their connotations. So autism spectrum disorder, we're not hugely fond of, because admittedly, although autism can indeed be a disorder, it can cause all kinds of problems and can make things quite difficult. And, I would myself say that it is a disability. There's just something kind of unnecessarily negative about the term disorder that makes it feel a little bit kind of pathologized, like it's an illness that needs curing or something along those lines, which, I mean, firstly is wrong because it's not an illness at all. It's just a thing that is, the condition is a clearer and better term. But also, it's not curable. There is no realistic way or ability there's nothing really to cure, unless you are somehow able to take a person's brain and totally rewire it, like some kind of, android from Star Wars. It's just not feasible. It's not a thing. And the great majority, I think it's fair to say, of autistic people, certainly that I know and have spoke to, don't actually like the idea of that, a cure or being cured or having autism kind of taken from us at all, because it's quite a key part of, who we are and our personalities. So condition is kind of by default a nicer term to use, I think. It's less pejorative, it's got fewer of those connotations, but it still has a clear kind of medical aspect to it. And I mean, obviously, autism has, it's got a lot to do with medicine, because it's part of the human condition. So obviously, the medical world and medicine is part of it. But we like to try and keep autism separate from that a little bit, because again, we want to avoid that idea of it being an illness, of it being of needing medication and that kind of thing. So even condition can be a little bit off-putting. I mean, for the most part, most autistic people are more happy just being referred to as autistic, or either having autism or ideally being autistic, rather than using the acronyms ASD and ASC. Simply because it feels like those other techniques are kind of a little bit like euphemisms. Like we don't want to use the word autistic, because I think there's a general sense in the community, especially among younger people, thanks to things like Fortnite, quite frankly, that autistic as a word is actually a slur term. It's like an insult that people throw at each other in the playground, and that spreads. That idea spreads into the general community, and of course, we in the autistic community, we don't really want that. That's not a great thing to happen. I mean, it has happened in the past. When you think about when I was growing up in the 1980s, I remember when I feel uncomfortable saying it even now, even though that's ludicrous, when the word spastic changed. It went from being a term that had clear medical meaning to becoming the word that everyone called each other in the playground, you know, back in the late 80s, early 90s. And that was that. The word was never reclaimed. It was lost. I mean, I don't think it's really used anymore, thankfully, in that way. But, you know, it just goes to show how easily a word can just be, you know, thrown out of the lexicon because it becomes too negative. And the last thing we want is for the word autistic to suffer the same kind of fate. So we're trying to reclaim it. And, you know, I think generally speaking, I did a poll on Twitter the other week. I think I got something like 6,000 votes about, you know, what do you prefer? How do you prefer it to be labelled? You know, do you prefer it to be I am autistic, or I have autism, or I am ASD, or I have ASD? And it was overwhelmingly autistic, just straightforward, you know, no messing around. Just, you know, I'm autistic, they're autistic, we're autistic, you know, keep it nice and easy. So, you know, that's certainly something that I would recommend that organizations, companies, the government, etc., really, you know, consider that it's not a bad term. It's not a taboo word.
Great. And then back to the first part of the question, what, you know, for the people that don't really understand, what is autism?
Of course, yeah, sorry, missed the most important part. Autism it's a, if you imagine that everyone's brain is wired in a certain way, you know, I mean, the brain is just a, you know, a large collection of neurons which are all kind of interconnected in a particular kind of architecture. And as far as we can tell, autism is simply a different architecture. It's just a different way the brain can be made. We like to, I mean, I quite like to compare it to operating systems on a PC. You know, you've got Windows, you've got iOS, you've got Linux and things like that, you know, and they all work very differently. And if you get used to one, that won't necessarily help you out with the other one. You know, the tools are different, the interface is different, they have different uses, different strengths and weaknesses and all the rest of it. So in many ways, it's like neurotypical people are Windows, you know, just, you know, the majority, and, you know, most people are familiar with it, and, you know, Windows machines work together very, very well. Whereas I would say that, you know, autistic people are probably more like Apple, or if you're more technology minded, Linux, you know, which I think is probably less pejorative because people don't like Apple, do they? I don't want to, you know, imply that, you know, that autistic people are like, you know, the Apple company, but, you know, that they don't necessarily intermesh very well. There's no kind of common ground, and when they're brought together, there can be clashes because the operating systems are so different, and they work in such different ways, and they use different resources and all the rest of it. So, you know, being autistic is just having that and being aware of it all the time, that your operating system, the way that you perceive the world, is different to how other people do. And that can be down to kind of social communication is where it comes out the most, because obviously communicating between humans is a very complex thing. It uses up a lot of, you know, kind of brain power, a lot of RAM, if you like, because it's tremendously complex, and, you know, it's filled with inferences and unsaid things that you're meant to kind of figure out, and, you know, lies and jokes and sarcasm and all this. You know, it's a tremendously complicated thing, and when you're autistic, because you're working on a different operating system, you can still do those things. I mean, for example, I get sarcasm. I can be sarcastic. But if I'm being sarcastic with a neurotypical person, it's like our sarcasms are different somehow. They don't quite mesh together properly. So we're both of us, really, it's not just limited to me as the autistic person. Both of us are at a bit of a disadvantage because we're not communicating smoothly and, you know, kind of easily. There's a kind of barrier there that makes things a little bit more difficult, and that barrier can be removed and eased and made less of an issue, you know, with the right kind of awareness and understanding and all the rest of it, which I'll try and talk about today. But it is there, and, you know, we would be remiss to not acknowledge that. And other ways the operating system might be different. For example, I probably experience my senses differently to a neurotypical person. I mean, it's very hard to say what that would be like because I don't know what it's like for a neurotypical person. But most autistic people experience, it's like, you know, if you think about Spider-Man in the Marvel films, you know, all of his senses are dialed up to 11, I think he says in one of the films. You know, so light and sound and touch and everything is way stronger for him. So he has to wear like goggles and stuff to calm everything down a little bit. It's very much like that, really. Only without the swinging between buildings, you know, that's sadly not part of the deal. So, you know, we find that if we're in a noisy, kind of colourful or bright environment, then all of that can get, you know, very much too much. and we can very quickly find ourselves sort of way too stressed and start to kind of really struggle to cope with whatever we're meant to be doing at that time. Whether you're children experience that, autistic adults experience that. It's why autistic people stereotypically are often wearing earphones to try and cut out that audio stimulus. Often wear sunglasses too. I mean, I've got autistic friends who wear sunglasses all of the time, not because they're kind of cool or anything, but just because it helps them, kind of ground themselves. And I remember Chris Packham in his documentary talking about his, the nature presenter who's famously autistic. He's got a whole room in his house, which is almost like a sensory deprivation room. Bare white walls. There's skylight, so you can see the stars in the evening, because that's quite pleasant and calming. But there's nothing in there really, so it's just a really calm, quiet space where you're not going to be faced with that kind of constant stimulus. So those two things together are the biggest issues that most autistic people face, and the ones that kind of crop up the most in the workplace, certainly. Because obviously social interaction is huge in any workplace, and obviously workplaces are physical places. You're at work, you're in an office, you've got strip lighting, you've got, monitors everywhere, you've got, artwork on the walls, you've got the mumble and chatter of people talking, or you've got, big machines running and all that kind of thing. So that's where it really becomes very relevant for the workplace, I think, those two things.
Sure. Is there like an element of synesthesia, where certain inputs cause other unexpected outputs?
There is, yeah, very frequently. Not across the board, not to the point where you could say that it's a kind of defined autistic trait, but it is common. It is pretty common. A lot of people I know have elements of synesthesia. I do to an extent. Numbers and colours for me go together in a peculiar way that I find difficult to explain. But for some autistic people, it can be very strong indeed. Like smells having very distinct colours, or vice versa. And yeah, there is thought that perhaps that is a kind of an artifact of this unusual wiring in the brain, of the senses being set up differently in our brains compared to neurotypical ones, and leading to all these kind of unusual and actually quite fascinating alternative ways of perceiving everything, really.
Definitely. Cool. What are some of the common myths surrounding autism?
I think one of the most common really is that we can't do this. The autistic people, we can't, but very often there's a bit of a stereotype that we're very quiet, that we don't really talk, that we don't have a sense of humour, that we are only interested in things that are technical and mathematical, and that we don't do sarcasm. They're probably the most common myths. And when I say common, I mean I'm talking really, really common. Like, if you went and spoke to anybody in the street, randomly approached some poor person and said, "Tell me about autism," the likelihood is they'd either be able to say nothing at all, because to be fair, you've just bothered them for no reason, or they would reel off a load of Rain Man style stereotypes, of someone who's mathematically gifted perhaps, or has some kind of magical ability to do something, like the
New York skyline from memory.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I got a good memory, for example, but that's not the case. That's not an autistic trait. That's more to do with other parts of your brain, functions. So those. But the thing is, they're quite damaging, those myths. Especially the ones about sense of humour and sarcasm. I mean, I remember at school being told, before I knew I was autistic, that autistic children didn't understand idioms. Sayings, like, for example, pull your socks up and you'll do better. And we were told, an autistic child will take that very literally, and they will literally try and pull their socks up to do better. I mean, it's possible that might happen, but actually the majority of autistic people, once we've heard something like that for the first time, then we kind of figure out what it means. We realize it's a metaphor. Metaphors aren't beyond us by any stretch, and we're good to go with that. I mean, I suppose the first time we hear it, we might not understand what people mean, but I would have thought that was true for everybody. If you've got like a 5-year-old being told to pull their socks up for the first time, it doesn't matter whether they're neurotypical or autistic. They probably will take it literally because they're 5. So it's not really as simple as that. It's more that we might not know when somebody's being sarcastic. We might not pick up on the little subtle hints. We know that sarcasm exists. We know that it happens. We're fine with it so long as we can recognize it. But we might not recognize the subtle variations in the facial expression or whatever it might be that gives the game away that someone's being sarcastic. It's like, to us, everybody is Jack D. Everybody is kind of deadpan and serious, and therefore we never really know. So, we can recognize it. We can accept sarcasm, but it can be difficult to recognize when it's actually being employed, I suppose. With regard to the speaking and the sense of humor and things like that, that can be very harmful, really, because it paints us as kind of, there are a few things more human than having a sense of humor. It's one thing that tends to bind people together, and it's, especially in this country, it's something that we tend to bond over, that little shared smile or shared little, joke or whatever it might be. So suggesting or implying that autistic people have no kind of way into that game, if you like, isn't very helpful, because it makes it sound like we're it will put us at a massive disadvantage, but it's simply not true. Some of the funniest people I know are autistic. Slightly different sense of humor. We often have quite a dark sense of humor. I think that's fair to say. Kind of often even bleak, but it's there. We can joke. Autistic comedians. Fern Brady recently got diagnosed. She was autistic about 2 months ago, I think, and she's a successful modern comedian. I've got my I wonder about people like James Acaster, to be quite honest. Just the way he is, I wouldn't be surprised. Then you've got Hannah Gadsby in the Australian comic. She's openly autistic because we can do jokes. So it's about those myths that dehumanize us, that make us less than ordinary humans. I think that I'm most concerned about, because they cause kind of long-term damage over time.
Definitely. Okay. I realise I've gone slightly out of order on our questions. There was your diagnosis. It came at a relatively late stage in life.
Yes.
It's not untypical for that to happen. What was that like, and what changed for you following your diagnosis?
It was quite a trip, to be quite honest with you. It was a huge thing. I was 34 when I found out, and I only found out because I'd been diagnosed with depression and I couldn't seem to shake myself out of it. So I was, I was searching around looking for, potential reasons and ways to fix that. And one thing that came up that seemed to, kind of reflect me quite a lot was autistic traits. So I pursued it, and lo and behold, I was. But on discovering that, it's huge when you discover that for your entire life you have struggled in a way that neurotypical people haven't. We'll talk later about the stress that autistic people feel on it, kind of constantly. You grow up feeling that that's how everyone must be. I grew up assuming that everybody hated, small talk and socializing, and had a very, very easily drained social battery. I just assumed everyone was like that. Like incredibly introverted and stressed out by everything around them and noticing everything. I thought that was the normal human experience. So when you discover that it's not, and actually you've been kind of you've been making up for that difficulty all your life, great personal cost. It's tiring. It's very, very tiring. Then that's quite a difficult thing to cope with. You look back at things like, I went to university, and would I have done better if I'd have known? It's very difficult to say, but you can't help asking the questions. And I remember at the time talking about it a little bit like, I don't know if any of people listening are late diagnosed or wondering whether they might need to be late diagnosed. But if you get diagnosed, your brain has to undergo almost a kind of defragmentation process. When you do that thing on your computer where your hard drive kind of compiles everything and puts it in a more straightforward order, to stop it being so slow. You have to do something similar. You kind of look back over your entire life, and you have to reevaluate everything, really, to write down individual interactions, if you remember them, to think about, well, how could that have panned out differently, and how did being autistic affect that, etc., etc. And that takes a lot of time. That there's a long period of that after diagnosis that you have to, well, from my point of view, and everyone that I've spoken to who's had a similar experience, you just have to run with it. You just have to go through that process, and it's tiring, but it's rewarding. I now feel far more in control of, you know, who I am, if you like. I feel more aware of how to make myself happier, I suppose, you know, more content, more relaxed, because I know what the rules of the game are now. I know what my kind of boundaries are. I know now that actually forcing myself to go to, you know, some kind of social situation for 4 hours is just daft. That's just a silly thing to do to myself. Don't force it, you know, because whereas before I would have forced it because I'd have felt, well, surely this is what everyone does, so I'll just do it. Now I'm allowed to kind of give myself a break and say, no, I'm not doing it. That's not good for me. That's going to tire me out. That's going to spoil tomorrow, or whatever it might be. So you can be kinder to yourself, I think, once you know that information.
Okay. So what are the key benefits to an organisation that autistic people typically bring when workplaces make proper provisions to include them? Where do they typically excel? And I know we're talking about myths, but where would they excel where neurotypical people might actually struggle? And what do the provisions look like when they're done well?
Well, I mean, yeah, the key thing is the provisions have to be there, because otherwise an autistic person who's in the workplace is more liable than to kind of burn out more quickly than a neurotypical person would. But we'll talk about, yeah, I'll bring up the provisions afterwards. In terms of benefits, it entirely depends, really, on the person. You know, as I said, we're not all kind of, skilled at one particular thing, but there are some areas where we tend to have a little bit of an edge. I mean, things like attention to detail are generally speaking quite a strength for autistic people. Very often autistic people look at how neurotypical people go about things, you know, with rolled eyes, thinking, how on earth, what are you doing? You've got to pay more attention to that. You've got to do that properly. So, you know, you get a lot of, I think for any job that involves quality assurance or, you know, a real fine attention to detail to make sure nothing's been missed, nothing's been forgotten, nothing's been sort of skated over, you know, and kind of swept under the carpet. That's something that a lot of autistic people can really bring a tremendous benefit to a company. There are other things, though. I mean, I think that, you know, generally speaking, because we've got our different wiring, we tend to be quite good. And again, I talk generally, of course. We tend to be quite good at thinking outside the box, you know, all those kind of, you know, corporate ideas like, you know, blue sky thinking and all the rest of it, because we always approach things in a different way, you know, and in some ways it's kind of annoying because, you know, in like a social situation, when we approach things in a different way, it's irritating for everybody. It's like, you know, deciding where to go for a drink and you say, well, but what about what about if it rains, or what about if the sun, we want to be around somewhere so when the sun gets low, it's kind of nice, you know, and we can sit in the sun, and people are like, what? Where's that come from? That can be a bit strange. But in the workplace, that kind of thinking of things that no one else would think of, that no one else would even consider, can be really, really useful. You know, it's just having kind of, you know, that wealth of experience that another neurotype brings can be a tremendous advantage. I mean, certainly as a teacher, I found that, you know, that often I would look at issues, when I was head of department particularly, I would look at issues from a totally different angle to everybody else. And that was very often very, very useful indeed, and tended to get, you know, good results because it's unique and it's a new way of looking at things. And very often that's what you really need. I'm conscious of the time. So in terms of provisions that need to be in place, again, they are going to be fairly personalised to the individual. But I know that if there are autistic people listening and watching this might be the thing where they're particularly interested. General ideas that work well are things to do with social communication in particular. So, for example, often it's just a case of people knowing that someone's autistic, and therefore, and also knowing about the whole issue around banter and sarcasm. Because one of the ways that an autistic person in the workplace can feel left out is if they're having a conversation, but that meshing isn't going very well, and it feels like, you know, there's a miscommunication there, and the sarcasm hasn't landed, the joke hasn't landed, the banter's gone wrong. And if there isn't an understanding of autism, if there isn't that understanding that person's autistic and they have this, and this issue with social communication, that could potentially be a career killer, you know, especially in high profile jobs, you know, where it's all about networking, it's all about, you know, that kind of first impression that you give off. That could cause huge problems for a person who's actually otherwise brilliant at that job. So it's about knowing, you know, if you're a manager, if you're in charge of a company, if you're a CEO or you're a line manager of someone, and they act in that kind of, we can come across a little bit awkward or a little bit kind of confused at times. It's knowing why that is and not assuming the worst. I think that's it, really. Not assuming immediate negatives like, oh, this person doesn't care, or this person's weird, or this person's not the right fit, that kind of thing that you can imagine happening. It's being more open-minded than that, I think, and knowing that we are dealing potentially all the time in our lives without knowing with people whose brains are wired differently. So if somebody does act a little bit strangely around you when you're using sarcasm or banter, then it's having a kind of a step in your brain before you just kind of dismiss them and think, well, they're weird, I don't want to deal with them. It's kind of, actually thinking, well, hold on, there could be a very good neurodiverse reason for this to have happened. Therefore, I will give them the benefit of the doubt, and quite a lot of benefit of the doubt, in fact. I think that alone, across the planet, really would help autistic people a great deal. Just that lack of an immediate dismissal, from someone's mind, or they're strange, I don't want to deal with them. Because it's amazing how often autistic people, just find themselves, cast away because of one interaction. Other things, though, to do with that we can get, anything sensory is good. So, for example, dress code is a big one. Are ties strictly necessary? I'm yet to meet an autistic person that actually likes wearing a tie. I think, generally speaking, in companies these days, ties are going out of fashion a little bit. I don't think they're as required as they were back in the day. But certainly in education, there is still that expectation that a male teacher will wear a tie. And they are, unnecessarily constricting. There's something about the sensory issue of, having something tightly around your neck, which, when you think about it, is perfectly reasonable. Who would anyone want something, tightly around their neck? I think neurotypical people are just more able to just kind of deal with it and just kind of go, well, it's what we do, so we'll do it. Whereas autistic people are more like to say, well, but why? This is pointless and it's really uncomfortable and I hate it. So, a loosening of dress code could be a good one. Across the board, I would say that some real thought going into the layout of offices, the layout of rooms, the layout of conference rooms, that kind of thing, and the lighting of them as well. So making sure that the lighting isn't the kind of strip lighting that's very, very glary, kind of halogen, really excessively bright lighting, because that can, before you've even started as an autistic person, that will put you on a back foot. Imagine if you're in an interview situation, you're autistic, they're not. You go into the interview, but everything about the room is screaming at you the moment you walk in. You're not going to be able to do as good a job as you would be able to otherwise. There's no two ways about it. You can try, and autistic people do. We get so used to having to push through that actually we get quite good at it. But it's tiring and it's hard and it's not really fair. So things like that. Hot desking is one thing that comes up a lot. I've never experienced it. The closest I've come to hot desking is having to change rooms as a teacher, and I hate that. I like to be in my own room, thank you very much. But this idea of coming into a classroom, coming into an office and not knowing where you're going to sit, that makes, even now, I'm sitting in my own house and I'm feeling terrified by the very idea of that. It's just,
you kind of want to pre-plan where you're going to go to.
You
plan that, get it all planned and
you have. Your routine is very important as an autistic person to try and keep the stress levels down. So, you like to feel like I'm going to go and sit by the window where I always sit, by that computer. I like that computer because it's remembered all my passwords. I don't know, it's I don't know what it could be. There might just be a fascinating bit of blue tack on the wall next to it that for some reason just really calms you down. I actually did have that once. I can't explain it, but it worked. So going into an office and not knowing where you're going to sit, I think is something that actively discriminates against neurodiverse people, and not just autistic. ADHD people will struggle with that too. And the number of adults in this country with ADHD who don't know it is huge. So that's another way that I think employers could make a big difference if there is the potential to cut down on the hot desking idea.
Of course. And I guess the interview thing would be akin to a neurotypical person walking into an interview and there being, say, very loud music playing.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, really loud music and kind of strobe lighting. And maybe a clown dancing on the table or something like that. They're completely off-putting, and unhelpful, and you're not going to be at your best in that environment. So yes, it would be. Yeah.
Cool. So autistic masking, what is this, and how do we help people who are very good at masking kind of drop their masks?
It's a good question. I mean, autistic masking is the ability that a lot of autistic people have, though not all, to basically present as neurotypical. We tend to spend, a lot of us have spent our entire childhoods and, young adult years intently studying neurotypical society, almost like, David Attenborough kind of thing, like trying to work out how it works, the rules, the conventions, the structures, in order to fit in, because obviously the alternative is to be different. And in a school or even a workplace, to be different is to be bullied. So, there is a good reason why autistic people do this, because obviously we don't want to have to deal with that. We don't want to be discriminated against. We don't want to be mocked or viewed negatively or bullied or anything like that. So we learn how to pretend, basically. So we kind of swallow down our autistic tendencies. And the most obvious one of those, I suppose, would be what we call stimming, which is a often physical, repetitive movement that autistic people utilize to regulate stress levels. So, for example, you might tap your foot quite furiously if you're stressed, as a way of getting some of that nervous energy out. Or you might, a stereotypical one, certainly for children, is rocking backwards and forwards. That's something that I think, you might have come across in the media. It's not actually as common as the media would suggest, but it is certainly one that exists. Or just playing with something, very often I will find myself, here's a Lego minifigure here. I will find myself just having one of those in my hands while I'm doing something like this. You can't see it, but I'm constantly manipulating it, taking its legs off, putting them back on again, just fiddling. If you remember fidget spinners back a few years ago, it might not have affected your world quite as much as it affected my world. I would hope it didn't really, but certainly in schools, everyone had a fidget spinner. They were everywhere. But they were originally stim toys for autistic people. They just went mainstream, and then got banned. So poor old autistic people who needed them could no longer use them. So that was a bit harsh. But if we're masking, we learn not to do that, because we know it makes people a little bit uneasy. I know, for example, that if I'm doing one of my stims that I do, like I say, with fiddling with something, it doesn't look very professional. It doesn't look like the sort of thing you should be doing in a workplace. So we learn not to. Sorry?
It's read as nervousness, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's read as nervousness, a sign of something else, often even a sign of dishonesty. Like you're fiddling because you're lying. Along with the eye contact thing, the fact that autistic people struggle with eye contact, I think neurotypical people can assume wrongly that we're lying a lot more than we actually are. For those reasons. So if we're masking, we hide all of that. We force ourselves not to do it, but that comes at a cost. That means then that we're not regulating our stress, that we're more likely then to have some kind of, meltdown or some issue occur where we can't cope. And it's, fundamentally negative. So we do it to fit in, but it costs us an awful amount of energy and brain, brain memory. I like my computer analogies. It uses a lot of CPU power, if you like, to be constantly doing that. It's almost like, if your PC was running an emulator constantly to run everything for no real good reason, it would just slow everything down and nothing would work properly. And you're not really benefiting in any way either. So, it's a little bit like that. So if you want to stop people masking, then it's about normalizing that kind of behavior. It's about making it so that it's okay not to make eye contact, because we can do it, and part of masking is forcing ourselves to do it. But to be quite honest with you, eye contact for the neurodiverse is far more intimate than it is for neurotypical people. We think, at least. We're not sure, because there's not very much research into this. But certainly anecdotally, it feels like for autistic people, eye contact is the sort of thing you make with a close friend or somebody who you're romantically involved with. It's not something you do with someone, an acquaintance or a colleague, not because you don't want to look at them, but just because it feels too much. So, there's no bad, it's not a bad thing. There's nothing kind of negative about not making eye contact from our point of view. But we know, of course, that in in your culture, in neurotypical culture, not making eye contact, particularly in, Western societies, is a huge no-no. You really have to make eye contact. Otherwise, everyone thinks you're lying. Everyone thinks you're distrustful. And, that you may as well just give up there and then. So we mask and we pretend and we force ourselves to do it, even though it actually feels deeply unpleasant, even painful at times. So it's about normalizing those behaviors and making it so that in the workplace, again, there's not that just immediate assumption of wrongdoing, if you like. If somebody makes eye contact or doesn't make eye contact, it needs to be more that before we assume they're lying, we assume they're autistic. In the kind of running order in your head. You might be wrong. They might not be autistic. They might be lying. That is possible. But the automatic assumption, I think, has to be more fair and more reasonable, which is maybe they're autistic. There's a good chance they probably are. It's not like we're a tiny minority. And only then, if you rule that, well, okay, maybe they're lying. So it's about changing that culture, but that is a big change. That is not something that's going to happen overnight by any stretch. So that's the sort of thing that I'm going to be spending an awful lot of time on, I think, for the next 40 years. Trying to improve as much as I can, as well as my friends and other people in the community.
So I think that leads on nicely to the next one, which is stress. Really, it's really common for people with autism to feel massively high levels of stress all of the time, which results in high cortisol levels and very high resting heart rates. So much so that sadly, heart disease is the biggest killer of neurodivergent people.
Yes.
I think you've covered most of it, but why is autism so stressful, and how do you manage your stress?
Most of the reasons are everything that I've talked about. If you're autistic, you've basically got a long lifetime, especially if you get to my age, nearly 40, you've got a long lifetime of failed communications, if you like, and just endless instances of things just going wrong when you're in conversation, or when you're chatting to someone, or when you're having a serious talk with someone, because of that non-meshing of the operating systems. And if you've had a lifetime of that, then that in itself means that you're going to seek to avoid that from happening, because it's in itself, it's inherently stressful. But as you can't avoid social interactions, not really, not very easily, without becoming an actual hermit, you're constantly on edge. You're just constantly just waiting for the next time to mess it up, to get something wrong, to find out you freaked somebody out, or find out you've insulted or offended somebody without meaning to, and that as a way of existence is tremendously, harmful. You're on tenterhooks really all of the time. Just waiting to find out, or just waiting to make a misstep that could be really quite serious. And you end up, a lot of autistic people actually have a form of PTSD called CPTSD, so chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, which isn't anything like as kind of like immediately severe as, for example, a soldier who's experienced terrible things in battle, but it's a more low-level, constant kind of stress and tension and trauma that leads to people around my age. Honestly, the life expectancy of an autistic person in this country is something like, I think it's mid-50s.
Yeah.
So, that means I've got 16, 17 years left, which isn't a great feeling. Obviously that's an average, and that is, changed by a lot of factors, but that is not a great statistic for us to have as a country and as a society.
Stressful in itself.
Yeah. It's. I don't want to get too heavy, because it's lunchtime for everybody. But another reason for that is obviously with all of this can come depression, and with depression can come thoughts of self-harm and all the rest of it, and that's sadly very common too. So in terms of managing stress, well, we're actually quite good at doing it ourselves. The only trouble is the things we do to manage stress aren't allowed, if you like. It's not like we manage stress by punching people. That's fair enough. That wouldn't be allowed. But we manage stress by stimming, like I described before, or by removing ourselves from the situation quite immediately, and without any real kind of say so, in order to kind of ground ourselves and calm down. But the trouble is those two behaviors are seen as very negative. Just walking out of a team meeting isn't going to look great on your to your bosses, or having quite an intrusive stim, like rocking backwards and forwards in the workplace is going to be viewed very negatively, and you're unlikely to get away with that very easily unless attitudes change. So we can manage our stress relatively well. It's just the ways we do it don't tend to be viewed positively. So we end up between a rock and a hard place. We either just let the stress envelop us, or we do weird things that people don't like and get a kind of black mark by our name, or we just melt down. And then who knows what's going to happen. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
So yeah, it's probably on the part of neurotypical people to become more permissive of things that allow you to manage stress.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah. So just to accept, like we accept that someone on a difficult phone call is likely to pace, up and down. That's like an accepted stim. That's a stim that neurotypical people will do. If they're nervous, you'll pace up and down, just naturally. And we accept that. That's seen as being perfectly valid and fine. But we don't accept other things, even though they're not really that different. They're a physical, repetitive movement designed to help you deal with stress. But some are fine and some are not. And sadly, the ones that aren't are the ones that autistic people tend to prefer. So yeah, it's just about, like you say, a more permissive kind of culture of, actually, you know what, that's fair enough. What Bob's doing over there, that's fine. That's not hurting anybody. It's not going to cause any problems. It's all cool. Would go a long way.
We're pretty much out of time. I've got one question.
Yeah, sorry.
That's good. We could probably go on for about another hour, I think. But we've got one question from the audience, which is, what's the biggest challenge you face as an autistic individual?
I suppose the biggest thing for me, I've already touched on it, it's that constant fear of social interaction, which becomes all consuming at times, especially if you've already had an incident of miscommunication with that individual. It's like from that point on forever, it's going to be tainted with that fear that that's going to happen again. And it can lead to all kinds of problems. It can make any kind of interaction with that person very stressful because you're just kind of waiting for it to happen. It's amazing, actually, how many autistic people tend to ghost people, just kind of completely sabotage, because, something like that happens and we just can't bear it. We just can't do that again. We can't cope with that happening again for whatever reason. And that can be really detrimental. I mean, partly it's our fault. Obviously, cutting ties with somebody is a big step. But we don't do it lightly, but we do it. And if you're cutting ties with somebody who is, a really close friend who's like a good emotional support, then that's going to have obviously massive implications on your well-being. Similarly, if you cut ties with somebody who's actually, useful in a career-based way, like a good contact or someone who you've met through networking, that can, hamper things on a professional level too. So I would say that's probably the most difficult thing. I really have to, force myself not to do that. I know it sounds awful, who'd want to employ me? But it's like, if something goes wrong, my temptation is just to be like, no, that's it. No more, not ever talking to that person again. I'm too embarrassed. I'm too ashamed. I'm too, absolutely overwhelmed by what happened. It's very strong and you really have to fight it. So I'd say that has a huge impact. That really is probably my biggest issue.
Yeah, and I'd say you probably, judging by this conversation, you probably don't need to worry.
Well, hopefully, yeah. Although after this, my brain will be thinking about all the potential things that went horribly wrong. Don't worry about that. It's inevitable. There's nothing I can do about that.
Sure. And then one last thing, you're currently writing a book. What's the process like, and how's the book going?
It's interesting. It's about special interests. So I've managed to basically wangle being allowed to write a book just about things that I like, which is quite a nice position to be in, really. So it's a book about how, all of my hobbies and special interests over the years have all kind of made me who I am. And in the meantime, kind of discussing a lot of autistic issues. And, it's like a means to an end. It's a way to open the conversation, if you like. So I'm getting to write about Lego and video games and music and all that kind of thing, so it's actually very enjoyable. It's, I try and get a little bit done every night, 500 words or so. I'm a little bit behind, but I'll catch up. But it's my first book, so, the whole experience is quite novel and I didn't intend that pun. The whole experience is quite new to me and quite exciting. So it's very positive, really. I just can't wait to have it done and published and out there in the world.
Exciting. Cool. We are out of time.
Yes.
I mean, I don't mind carrying on for a couple of minutes if you do, because there's some other interesting questions which have come through from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, if people are still willing to listen, and I'll keep talking for a little bit longer.
Yeah, we've still got 68 people online. Okay, so someone asks, you don't have to answer this if it's too personal, but as a young child, did you ever struggle with speech? As my 5-year-old son, who is being diagnosed, is very behind in his speech and has had big problems in social interactions with other neurotypical children.
I didn't, to be honest. I mean, I fit under the old diagnosis of Asperger's, which is kind of being phased out now for various reasons. And one of the defining traits of that is that there aren't those delays in your youth, of speech and communication. But obviously, for a lot of autistic people, there are, and I've got a lot of autistic friends who are, essentially mute, for quite a long time in their youth. The advice I can give, if it's advice really, like I say, it didn't really affect me, so it's difficult to talk from personal experience. But what I gather is that it's simply a different time scale, and because obviously everything is very, very strict when you're bringing up a child. You've got your red book, milestones that have to, that expect to be met at certain times, and that's great for the vast majority of the population, but it doesn't work for everyone. It doesn't work for neurodiverse people. The time scale is just very, very different. The chances are reasonable, although I mean I wouldn't want to say, I'm not a doctor, so I can't say with any certainty. It will happen, it will come. It will just come at a different time. Anecdotally, I remember Albert Einstein, famously probably autistic, we don't know for sure, but certainly, seemed to be. I don't think he spoke he didn't speak openly until he was about 5 or 6 years old. And he turned out okay. He did all right in the end. And a few of my friends now, somebody I know very well who's a professional data analyst now, they were mute for about 3 years in their primary school days. Just selective mute, just would not talk in front of most people. I think the only person they'd speak in front of was one of their parents. And again, they got through. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't an end point. It wasn't something that caused really long-term issues. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't talk about it from a personal level, but that's certainly the impression that I've got from my friends and from my community. So, it's worth bearing in mind, and have a look at what autistic people are saying about that on Twitter and online, because we talk about that kind of thing quite a lot.
Thank you. Cool. And then we'll just do one more before we wrap up. And this is, should autistic people be more open and share their condition? Otherwise, how would we know to support?
Well, indeed, yeah. I mean, this is the eternal paradox, isn't it? It's like how can we help people if they're not going to tell us? I think what we have to bear in mind and be aware of course, is that there are reasons why autistic people won't disclose, and those reasons are all of the things basically that I've talked about today. Because attitudes and acceptance levels and permission levels aren't very good at the moment, we feel very often that to disclose would probably cause more harm than good. Yes, sure, we might get reasonable adjustments and all the rest of it, but it might damage our career irrecoverably. Which it's a hard thing to toss up. I mean, I know a lot of people who are quite high. They've got pretty high level jobs who, I know they're autistic, but no one at their workplace does, because they are genuinely, and I think quite reasonably, scared of telling people, because, the way things are at the moment, the likelihood of that kind of coming back and biting them, unpleasantly is unfortunately quite high. So it's about, it's almost like the culture's got to show change before more autistic people will be comfortable to do that. It's like, luckily there will be autistic people who are willing to take that hit for the community, if you like. I mean, like I did, I just told my workplace straight away. I didn't care. And there are enough of us, I think, to kind of get that ball rolling. But with regard to those who are a bit more cautious, I think fair enough, let them be cautious, and let's prove to them that it will be okay to open up. Because until we've done that, you can't expect them to, really, if they have genuine concerns, you know, which are almost certainly going to be grounded in reality, unfortunately.
There's still some work to do to destigmatize.
There is, yeah, an awful lot. But we're getting there. You know, things like this help, you know, and the more that people do this kind of thing and listen into things like this, listening to autistic people sharing their lives and thoughts, read our books, you know, the better. You know, it will all help.
Well, once again, thank you so much for coming in and taking your time to present, and I hope everybody who's tuned in has now gained a bit of understanding, and we can take the next steps towards making our workplace an even more inclusive one. Thanks, everyone.
I hope so. Yeah, that would be the aim. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been really good. I've been very, you know, it's nice to do this kind of thing for companies that are, you know, trying to do that extra mile and actually get their heads around the issue in a more kind of constructive way, because it's a really positive thing to see. So yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.